I am Stephen Edholm from SkillCult.com. Welcome to my homestead. I have been experimenting with tanning leather for almost 30 years. So when I make these videos, I usually know more or less what I'm talking about, and you should listen to me when I tell you which tools you need to make bark tanned leather. Now, if you want to know the entire process for bark tanning, the best resource I know right now, as of the making of this video, is my series on making strops from scratch, where I go through the whole process with a deer hide, and you can get a pretty good idea of what you need to do from that. So, what we call bark tanned leather, also known as vegetable tanned leather, and in that case, vegetable is referring to plants in general, not vegetables that we eat like we think of now. That's old school terminology. Vegetable tanning is using tannic acid from plant sources, that could be roots, leaves, fruits, or barks, to tan leather. You can make a lot of different kinds of leather. This, for instance, is a heavy, hard, dense leather. Soft leathers like this. You can make smooth leathers, or you can make leathers that are kind of in between. They have a little bit of body, but might be a little bit more pliable. So I'm going to outline the process for you real quick, so that as we go through these different tools. Alright, you need to shut up. I have to throw acorns at you. She doesn't care. Go have your issues somewhere else. Before we get started, I'm going to run through this process as just an outline so that you understand when I talk about these different tools and what they're used for, you know what process I'm talking about. Now, there are endless variations to this, but I'm just going to outline like a real basic, typical type of a process. When we get the hide off the animal, we need to get off the flesh and fat and other extra tissue that isn't leather. We'll do that again and go over the flesh side numerous times, but you go for a first fleshing that's going to get the bulk of it off. If the hair is going to be removed, it's usually soaked in lime or wood ashes, which are alkali, caustic alkali. They loosen the hair and allow us to push it out. So then we actually push the hair out, and then we need to rinse out all that alkali from the skin. The alkali will make the hide all plumped up and rubbery and thick, and that involves repeated rinsing and scraping. So we're going to rinse, scrape, rinse, scrape, rinse, scrape until it's all floppy and loose like it was before it went in the lime. When it's time to tan the hide, we want to take our tanning material, chop it, grind it, whatever we need to do to get out the tannin, and then either soak it or cook it in water to make a solution and tan the hide in that. We can also layer the skin with layers of ground tanning material and skin, and then cover that with water or bark tanning solution, but that also doesn't require any real specialized tools. Once the skin is penetrated all the way through with the tan, or tanned as much as we want it to be, then we take it out, scrape over the flesh side, clean it up, scrub it, wash out the extra tan, and then it's time to finish. Finishing the leather can be relatively simple or fairly complicated depending on what you're trying to do and what kind of leather you're making, what kind of skin you have in the first place. This, for instance, is just oiled and then smoothed out and dried flat, and it's pretty hard. It's good for sheaths and stuff like that. Sometimes you want the skin to be even denser and harder than that, and so you can actually compress it. Or you might want the skin to be really floppy, in which case you're going to oil it differently, you're going to use different oils, and you're going to work it differently. Or you might want it in between, like this, which has kind of got quite a bit of body and it's not really stretchy or that pliable, but it's much more pliable than that. And of course, once your nice leather is all finished, you're going to want to use it, but that's an entirely different trade, different set of tools and all that. So let's get started. If you're going to skin animals yourself, all you really need is a sharp knife. Helps to have a rope too. Watch my video on skinning animals cleanly to how to get them off without cutting them up. You also may need to store the skins. I have a video on salting skins and just talking about the options: drying, freezing, and salting. In tanning, the most indispensable frequently used tools are the duo of the tanning beam and the tanner's knife, also known as a fleshing knife usually. These come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes. You can get away with a lot of different things if you're just kind of a casual home tanner. There's also a lot of new stuff on the market, and I'll show you one in a second. I would say that my recommendation is around 20 inches long with a 10 to 12 inch blade, maybe up to 22 inches or something like that. You can make them at home. Watch my video, Fleshing Knives 101, for the full lowdown on that. Here's some examples. This is made from an old planer blade with some rubber tubing for handles. This is an old school European style knife. That's really cool. This is one that I forged with antler handles, which I like a lot. This tool is a Weeb 12-inch flesher. I just got this in the mail and I haven't used it yet, but just looking at it, it looks great for an under $30 knife. Who knows if it'll hold an edge or not, but even if it doesn't, I could use this, as long as it doesn't break, I could use this for tanning everything I do for the rest of my life and get away with it. Would it be ideal? Not necessarily, but it would be quite good actually. And so I'm going to go out on a limb and recommend this for an affordable option. It's stainless, looks real nice. but a little tentatively because I haven't actually used it yet. Most beams are wood. I prefer to use wood. I would try to stick with something 8 inches in diameter or larger because of the radius of the curve. You can change that though. If you have to use a small log, you could flatten off the radius with an axe and a draw knife to get something that's more equivalent to, in curve, to a larger log basically. But try to stick with 8 inches and up. Maybe the most important thing is you want a relatively clean, smooth surface. This one's kind of cracked and messed up because it's been out in the weather for years and it's definitely overdue for being replaced. But you want everything from about 3 inches down to at least 20 inches down, like a 20-inch space, maybe 24 inches, that's nice and clean. That means no huge cracks, no big knots, no giant gouges and tears and stuff like that. If you have a round log, as long as the grain is straight, and if I was selecting a tree, I would select a straight grain tree just for this purpose. I would split it in half down the middle and then maybe hollow out the underside too. Watch my video on splitting billets for kind of tips and tricks on that. The reason is that's going to reduce the incidence of cracking, but also the severity of cracking. The thicker a piece of wood is, and especially a round log with the center that's still in, like the center of the bullseye and the rings, the more likely it is to crack and the larger the cracks will be. So if we can take that log, split it in half, hollow out the underside a little bit and make it more like a slab that's more of an even thickness, that will reduce both the severity and incidence of cracking. A great place to get almost a ready-made beam is to go to a lumber mill or talk to someone that does custom milling, because one of the first things I often do is slab off these slabs off the side of round logs, and then they start milling out the lumber. Those guys rarely have any use for these things. They just cut them up for firewood usually, so they'll probably give you a couple of them for free. Go to a local lumber mill, look in the phone book for custom milling, or go to your local chainsaw shop and ask those guys who does that. As far as what kind of wood to use, you can get away with a lot. Don't worry about it too much. My preference is maple here, big leaf maple on the west coast. I'm sure other maples are good. A lot of people use cottonwood. Willow's good, but you just kind of use what you have. I think this one's fir, or unless it's redwood, sapwood, but either way it works fine. Don't worry about that too much. Lengthwise, you're looking at 5.5 to 6.5 feet. I would go with 6 to 6.5 feet. This is 6 foot 4 inches, and I really like this one. Another option is plastic. This is actually ABS, which is pretty thin-walled. PVC would be even better. I would go with at least 8 inches if you can afford it. 10 inches would be better. For legs, this just has 2-inch holes drilled in it and sticks just stuck in there. That works fine. You can do the same thing with a wooden beam. This wooden beam has 2x3s that are lagged in on edge with just enough space to slip in a piece of plywood for a stand. And it's kind of floppy, but honestly every beam I've ever set up has been this kind of floppy, messy thing. And you just find a way to make it work. You know, put rocks on the end, stick it under a stump, put stakes around the legs or whatever, and it always seems to work out. There's a couple tools you might need for maintaining your beam. You need to put the beam in good condition and smooth it off in the first place, and then if it gets damaged, you need to fix it. Those are the draw knife and spoke shave. If I was going to pick just one of these, I would pick the draw knife. It's a little bit more versatile. It'll do all the heavy work that you need to do, and then you can still use it to smooth the surface pretty much. And if you need it smoother than that, you can use scraping, sandpaper, etc. This is just a great tool to have around anyway. They're really not that expensive on eBay. I think you could probably still get a high quality used one for 20-25 bucks because there's just so many of them out there. The spoke shave is more of a refining tool and something you'd use to kind of clean the beam up here and there. If you're going to buy a spoke shave, get one with some kind of an adjustment for the depth of cut. Like this is a Stanley number 53, which has kind of a unique mechanism with this little screw that moves the jaw. And a lot of them will have just 2 screws up here that you turn. It adjusts the blade in and out. What I would not recommend is getting the type where there's just a screw right here that you loosen and then kind of have to adjust the blade manually and then try it and keep doing that and screwing around. It's just, there's no good excuse for buying one of those unless it's like super cheap. Rubber apron, elbow gloves, and rubber boots. I think out of these, the most essential to me would be the elbow gloves. I don't like using any kind of short gloves because you're going to stick your hand into some kind of solution. They're going to fill with water. It happens every time. These are the Atlas nitrile elbow gloves. They're about 12 or 13 bucks on Amazon, I think, and I'll put a link in the description. They run a little small. If you think you have medium hands, get the large. I have medium hands, and these medium, they're too small. Shopping for aprons, keep in mind there's a big difference in quality. This apron I got at a yard sale 20 years ago. It's heavy duty rubberized cloth and it's still going strong. So look at the reviews and try to get one that's has a cloth backing or is rubberized cloth. Water is both a tool and a material. You're going to use it all the time. You're going to use a lot of it. It's nice to have a hose handy all the time for rinsing because you're going to constantly be rinsing your tools, the hide, your hands, etc. So get a hose hooked up if you can, and also put a shutoff valve on it so you don't have to keep walking back to the spigot to turn it on. Shutoff of some kind gives you a variability of flow. So I actually like these simple shutoff valves because I can open it wide open to fill containers really fast, or I can dial it down to any point I want and get a decent amount of pressure. And I have low pressure, and that's enough to wash a lot of stuff clean, you know, kind of like spraying it off. The gun type squeeze sprayers are nice for washing stuff off, but they don't have the same kind of high flow like this when you want to fill something up. If you want a great hose for really cheap, Craftsman puts these rubber hoses on sale every year. Watch my review on those, and they're like 20 to 25 bucks for a 50-foot hose, and I don't think you're going to find a better deal for durability. They never get stiff, and they're super tough, so you can walk all over them, and they're great. Brushes are nearly indispensable. They're the best way to clean your tools, your apron, your boots, the beam, all that kind of stuff. You want a stiff brush for that. Something like this or this one is a good multi-purpose brush. It's pretty stiff. But there's one other thing you'll use a brush for, and that's removing something called bloom from the grain side of the hide. With certain tanning materials, and especially with pit tanning, or layering it's called, where you layer the skin with the shredded bark, you get this stuff called bloom, and it's just a whitish deposit, but it's actually kind of tough and hard to get off. So the best way to remove that is with a brush, but something more along the lines of a medium hairbrush. Unfortunately, mine is missing, so I can't show you, but as long as you're not damaging the grain and you're getting the stuff off, then that's good. You'll need containers of specific kinds for bark tanning. As far as materials go, avoid anything that can rust or has rust on it because it will permanently stain the hide. Safe materials are plastic, rubber, glass, stainless steel, wood, ceramic, enamel. I'll use galvanized containers if they're absolutely clean with no scratches or rust, but only for liming and rinsing. Aluminum I'll use for rinsing, and that's about it. You need to match the size of the container to the hide that you're tanning to some extent. You don't want it to be way too big or way too small. So if you're tanning things like fur skins and, you know, small fur bearers, you could probably get away with buckets like this. Let's say that I have a sheep hide that I want to tan, and I stuff it in here in a tanning liquor or the lime liquor or something. It's going to be all stuffed against itself and crushed in there. It's going to be touching the walls of the bucket a lot. And the solution basically isn't going to be able to get in there and work on the hide. If we take that hide and put it into here, then it's going to have room to move around for the liquor to get to every part of the skin. We're still going to have to stir it a little bit, but it's better. Now if we took, let's say, a kiddie pool or some huge container and put it in there, then suddenly we need a lot of liquor to fill that whole thing up just to get the thing to work. So there's quite a bit of leeway there, but you don't want to have stuff too crowded or in gigantic containers. The shape of the container can be a factor too. I really like these rectangular tubs because I can use them for a process called layering. So in layering, you fold the skin up with layers of bark in between. Now traditionally you would lay the hide flat on a layer of bark, add some more bark, another hide, more bark, more hide, more bark, and you just make this sort of lasagna. Well, that's fine if you have a big container and you're tanning 20 hides at a time, but if you're only tanning one hide at a time, and again you throw, say, a deer hide in a kiddie pool, then you have this weird situation with all the extra room around the outside, and you're going to have to fill it up quite a bit to get it to work. So if we take that same hide and I put a layer of bark in here and I lay part of the hide in there, put some bark on top of that, fold it over, and then add more bark and fold that, and kind of fold it, an accordion fold it around. As long as there's bark between every layer of skin, then I'm good. I fill it up with liquor or water and let it sit for 1 to 3 months. So for that reason I like these, because every time you fold a hide, what do you make? A straight edge, right? So that straight edge is going to go well in this tub, and it's not going to go so well in these round wine barrels behind me. Because every time you lay that folded skin in there, you have a big wasted space where that straight edge meets a curved wall. Round containers are okay. You can get away with them. I've tanned in these guys quite a bit. Depends on how much you're tanning, what method you're using, etc. Round tubs are also nicer for stirring because, you know, they're round and the stuff moves around really easy. So if you have round containers already, or that's what you can get for free or cheap, you could use them. It's not that big of a deal or anything. But if you're going to go out and buy something, I think that these rectangular tubs are kind of the most versatile. You do want to have some buckets around because they're useful for other stuff, for transferring liquors and who knows what. They're just useful. I use them all the time. So get some buckets. These rectangular tubs are widely available. They come in a lot of different sizes. You can be used for storing salted hides and for all the other different processes. For things the size of goats, deer, sheep, this size right here, which I think is around 18 gallons, I'm thinking, maybe 18 to 20 gallons is a good size. When you get into things like moose and elk and buffalo and cattle and horse, then you want to look at something a little bit bigger, maybe go up to like 30 to 40 gallons. I've used these wine barrels a lot. I really like having them around because they're so cool looking and they're very romantic and all that. Practically speaking, they're not the greatest. You have to keep them filled with water or liquid or they'll dry out and start to leak. That means they're breeding mosquitoes all the time, and then you have to dump them out all the time, which is actually not that easy because they're really big and they're heavy, and the barrel itself is heavy. It's not just the water. You know, I'll probably replace these when they wear out, but they're not the most practical thing, so I wouldn't go out of your way to get them. I certainly wouldn't pay more than about $30 for one. They're very expensive new, but once the wineries use them for a while, the flavor gets leached out into the wine, and then they don't use them anymore and they just get rid of them. Like many tanners, I use these rectangular tubs a lot, probably the most, but I also have a large collection of other, stock tubs and miscellaneous containers that I use. A lot of our tanning materials need to be chopped or ground up to make them into small pieces so we can easily extract the tannin with water. For bark and wood, I will just put down a large tarp, set down a chunk of firewood or something, and start chopping it with a hatchet into little pieces. For most people, including myself, I wouldn't recommend using a hatchet really any heavier than this. And it's not just a matter of how strong you are, how big your arms are, etc. It's also about how used your body is to that repetitive stress or similar repetitive stress, like using a hammer or something like that. This is kind of more your average size American hatchet, and this is perfectly fine. It's totally adequate to the task and certainly a better place to start for most people. For a more industrial solution, you could be looking at chipper shredders like garden shredders or the big industrial type. With the big industrial ones, you can throw anything in there, but they're real expensive to rent, and so unless you're shredding just a huge quantity of bark at once, it's probably not worth it. The small ones work. I've used them, but you really need to reduce the stuff to small enough pieces that it's not going to bog down the shredder, because the average garden shredder just isn't that heavy duty. The other thing that could help is to do the bark when it's green instead of dry, because it's much, much softer. If there's any rust inside of the mechanism, you should run a bunch of other stuff through, like a bunch of branches and leaves and stuff, to try to kind of clean some of that out. You definitely don't want any rust in your tanning liquor and tanning materials. A lot of smaller materials don't really need to be shredded. If it's something that's pretty soft or at least not super hard, you might be able to just throw it in a blender and grind it up a little bit. Certain things like acorn caps and oak galls, I don't bother to bust up very much. Just throw them in whole or break them up a little bit. It just depends on the material, and there's so many different materials that you're going to have to figure out what to do. But what you usually don't want to do is put in giant chunks of stuff like this, because you're not going to get everything out, or not going to get as much out, and it's going to take a long time. It is possible to leach the tannic acid out of the material with cold water, but it's going to take a lot longer and you're not going to get as much out. So most of the time it's preferable to cook it. I use these large stock pots. This one's a 6-gallon, so I use things from about 3 to 6 gallons. Good ones are expensive, but they're a lifetime investment, and I find for my lifestyle they're pretty much indispensable. Quality-wise, there's a lot of cheap ones out there. The factors you really want to look at are wall thickness, general quality of design and construction, which usually has to do with the handles, whether they're going to fall off or not, and steel quality. So, if you're buying on Amazon, read the reviews really carefully, because sometimes the steel is really low quality if they're imports. If the walls are thin, that's totally fine if you're only cooking bark, or it doesn't matter if you burn stuff. But the thin bottom will burn really easily if you use it for anything else. It won't wear out because it's stainless, so unless you punch a hole in it, even a super thin one should last a long time. Another thing you can do is just cut the top out of a beer keg. A lot of home brewers do that. I also scored a large stainless pool filter one time. It's really heavy duty. It has a big heavy lid on top, and it has a hole in the bottom which I plumbed to have a valve, so I can fill that thing with bark, build a fire underneath it, and when the liquor's done, I drain it off the drain on the bottom. But you can't find those with that kind of a lid. Usually they're split, so the bottom and the top are about the same size, and that makes it fairly worthless for cooking. But if you happen to see a stainless pool filter that's tall with a short lid, snag it. They're awesome. One of the finishing tools is just a large smooth slab of something. It could be plastic or stone or concrete or wood. A lot of people have access to maybe a large sheet of plywood that's smooth on one side. This one here is just a big slab of plastic. It's pretty smooth on one side, about 3/4 of an inch thick. There's two main tools we use on this, the slicker and the slicking iron. I'm going to bring you in closer so you can see these things up close, and I'll show you what they're used for. This is a finished piece of leather, but I'm just going to use it to demonstrate here. You use the slab in these tools when you want a piece of leather to be flat and smooth. When it first comes out of the tan, you're going to put the grain side down, flesh side up, and use the slicking iron to basically stretch the skin from the inside toward the outside and start to smooth out the wrinkles and inconsistencies. So usually when it comes out of the tan, the edges will be real wavy and it'll be kind of shrunken up and maybe a little misshapen. And so you're just going to use this to kind of start to flatten it out and also just get it kind of stretched out to the sides as much as possible, because it'll be kind of shrunk up. Now some of that is done on the beam when it first comes out, but this is a really helpful tool. The other thing this will do is take some of the liquid out sometimes. So if there's a lot of liquid in the skin, you'll be kind of squishing it out of the hide and off of the edges. It doesn't have a very sharp edge, but it has enough friction, like there's enough of an edge that it kind of grips in there, and it'll grip the hide and stretch it outward like that. I'd say if you're going to make one of these, make it about 4 inches this way without the handle and about 5 inches wide. I think this is 4.5 inches wide. The edge is radiused very slightly, or it can be flat along here, but you just want the edges to drop off, and definitely round these off real well. Again, it's not sharp, like I couldn't cut myself with it or anything like that, but there is a little bit of an edge, so it's grippy. The ideal handle for this would be more teardrop shaped, so thicker than this up here and thinner down here, so it kind of fits the hand like that. Use stainless if you can get it. If you can't, carbon steel's okay. Cheap scrapers like this are widely available. This one I would cut down to about 5 inches wide, and it would be nice to have a different handle on it, and then take a file and kind of round these corners off and bring this to an edge and then dull it to the right dullness. And these things are probably like $4 or $5. Next we're going to take this and flip it over, and that's where this tool is used. These were traditionally made with slate or glass. You can make a slate one pretty easy. Like if you live in a region where there's a lot of slate roofs, you can get a piece of slate that way, or if there's any slate quarries. The stuff is pretty easy to work. This should be rounded off to a radius and polished smooth, and the edges need to be rounded real smooth and real gradual. So this tool is used to further smooth out these wrinkles and just kind of like work them down until there's as few wrinkles as possible. It also finishes this side smooth, so when it's wet you can just dent it easily. Like if I tap it like that, it's going to leave a dent, for instance. So I'm going to take this tool, and as I get it all laid out, I'm just going to start doing nice smooth strokes like that to leave the surface perfectly smooth. You can buy slickers made of glass because some leather workers still use them. I would make the glass one about 3/8 of an inch thick and about this size, which is about 5 by 4, I guess. Now the slicker is used with oil on the skin, so we're going to oil the skin first and then use the slicker. The other thing we'll do is, after using the slicking iron, put fat all over this side and then flip this over, and this is exactly how this skin was finished. And then start work on the grain side, but don't ever move this skin again. And we're actually going to use the slicker to paste the skin down and stick it with that fat we put on the back, say like some deer fat or tallow, or even lard can work, but it's better to have a little bit thicker fat. And we're just going to smash that down, and it's going to actually stick to the board. If we dry it nice and slow, it'll dry flat. Like sometimes the edges will curl up a little bit or something like that, but that's not really a big deal. So that's the other use of your board, is drying skins flat, and it's very useful for that. Your options otherwise are to use a frame and lace it into the frame, or you can nail it up to a wall. If you nail it to a wall or a piece of plywood, use galvanized nails, and preferably hot dipped galvanized nails, because they won't rust. Don't use anything that's already rusty, and preferably don't use anything that's going to rust, because rust will stain the hide black wherever it touches it. So for some leather, that's going to be it. You just let it dry, let the oils soak into the hide, and maybe that's your sheath leather or something you would make boots or belts out of or something like that. This piece was done that way, but then it was re-dampened slightly and worked a little bit, and that's what we're going to go talk about next. Alright, let's look at some softening tools. This is called a graining board. It's used for softening the skin and creating a certain effect on the grain side. It's just a piece of wood with a hand strap, and it has grooves cut across here like this. So the way this works is I'm going to fold the skin grain side to grain side. It's damp, not wet, not dry, and I'm going to set this on here and roll the skin like that. What that does is, first of all, it compresses the grain. So if I fold it grain to grain, it's going to make the grain wrinkle right wherever it's folded. And if I do that in different directions, it makes this cool wrinkled effect, which is called, the process is called graining. So if you want the grain to remain smooth, then you don't do that. The other thing that's happening is I'm just bending the hide really sharply, and that kind of breaks it and works it and softens it. This is one that has the grooves across here like that. So I'm going to glue on a piece of cork here, but this is also a little different in that it's going to have a post handle right here, and then it'll have a strap there, and that's called an arm board. I'll cut in a picture of an antique one you can look at. So this is just going to be a little bit more efficient for working large hides or doing a lot of work. Now the reason for the cork face is because if you don't want the grain wrinkled, then when you do that, you have to fold the hide with the flesh side to the flesh side instead of the grain side to the grain side. So you need something that's going to provide a little bit of grip and grab onto the skin and help you roll it, but it's not going to damage the grain. Now you don't necessarily need any of these tools. For instance, I never made a cork board yet, and I do this by hand. So I've softened this skin by just kind of, however, rolling it with my hand or something to, bend the hide in the same way. The other way you can do it is just roll the whole hide up, or part of the hide, into a roll like that, and then roll it like this to work it. And usually you're going to want to do that in a lot of different directions, front to back, side to side, and diagonal. That's how this was softened, and that's how this was softened. Sometimes you might have a piece of leather that's heavy and dense and you want it to be more heavy and dense, so you can take it in a damp state and pound the grain surface to compress it. It'll get quite a bit thinner and a lot denser and harder. That's what this mallet is for. It's made out of ironwood, so it's extremely heavy. You want this face to be dead smooth, and you want it to just round real slowly off at the corners. Okay, this tool is called a stake. It's just a post with a blade set in it. You can just use a sharpened piece of wood, like a sharpened post, but it doesn't work nearly as well. This one has a small stainless blade screwed in here. This is something that you would use a lot more for furs, because you can't work the fur side at all, right? And you need a way to bend and stretch and work the flesh side of a fur. So you just throw it over the top of here and pull it over, and what that does is it bends the fibers sharply and kind of breaks them open and softens the skin. These can also be handy if you're trying to get a piece of bark tanned leather really, really soft, because it does provide like a really strong bend and it stretches the hide out. So the rolling on the table doesn't stretch the skin as much. So this can really help you get those skins extra soft. So you can probably see here how much that stretches the skin, and again, this is something that's done while the hide is damp. So you're going to damp the hide back. We'll have to talk about actually how to do that in an actual tanning video, and as it dries you work the skin like that to break it and soften it. If I were going to make a blade for multi-purpose use for a home tanner, it would probably be about 6 inches wide. You just kind of want the blade supported back here and screw it on with stainless screws, and then you can just leave it in the rain or not have to worry about it rusting or anything. It doesn't have to hold an edge. It's not sharp at all. You can make it a little bit sharp for certain uses, but in general it's going to be, have a little friction to it, but it's not going to be sharp like this. There's no way you could cut yourself with this. I hope this video answered your most critical questions about the subject. Of course, there are some satellite skills that you might need to make tools and maintain them, such as sharpening and tools for sharpening, but we can't cover those today. If this video is successful, I might do another one on tools for brain tanning, because they're a little bit different. So let me know if that's an interest to you. I'll probably also do one on tanning materials for bark tanning, because that's also an important topic, and I get lots and lots of questions on that. I have 2 important tanning playlists that I'm going to link in just a few seconds here at the end of the video. One is the Strops from Scratch series, which follows the tanning of a deer hide from start to finish, and the other one is just a general tanning playlist where I put all of my tanning videos. It's a little random, I kind of jump around topics a bit, but there's a lot of good critical information, and of course I'll be adding to that in the future.